Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Spencer Ruckty. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm the author events manager here at Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington. And on behalf of the store, I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's event with Dana Spiotta, who's here to talk about her new novel, Wayward, in conversation with Chanelle Benz. Through virtual events like tonight's, Third Place Books is very fortunate to continue connecting readers with authors in an intimate setting. We sorely miss having authors and all of you in the store, but at the same time, we're very grateful to have this new platform that brings our growing event series right into your homes all across the world. So thank you again for tuning in and supporting independent bookstores. Coming up on our virtual events calendar, we have a joint virtual event with Powell's in Portland on Wednesday, July 14th, with the music critic Jessica Hopper in conversation with Anne Friedman. They're both discussing the gargantuanly cool reissue of Jessica Hopper's new book, or classic book, I suppose I should say, the first collection of criticism by a living female rock critic. On August 2nd, we also have Katie Kitamura for her highly anticipated new novel, Intimacies, which I wanted to bring up today because mere hours ago, Barack Obama named it as one of 11 books on his summer reading list, which is pretty cool. And we have so much more in store for you. You can find our full events calendar on our website at thirdplacebooks.com, where I also encourage you to sign up for our email newsletter. In a couple of minutes in the Zoom chat below, I will be sharing a link to purchase tonight's featured book, Wayward, which I'm very excited to say my favorite critic at the New York Times, Parul Sehgal, praised pretty lavishly last month, calling it a, quote, furious and addictive new novel. If you're in the Seattle area, you can order online and pick up in the store, or just swing by any one of our locations at Lake Forest Park, Ravenna, or Seward Park. We're happily open to the public and we ship all over the country. Really, overall, thank you. I just want to thank you all for sticking around with us during this virtual era. It's strictly because of you that this author series is even possible. A little bit more housekeeping. During tonight's event, I'd like to remind you that the chat window at the bottom of your screen is open and we encourage you to use it respectfully. Tonight we'll also have some time for your questions. So if you have questions for our authors this evening, please submit those in the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen, which is separate from the chat window. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, sometimes technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. So thank you so much for your patience and your understanding. And now let's introduce tonight's speakers. You'll know Dana Spiotta as the author of Innocence and Others, Stone Arabia, Eat the Document, and Lightning Field. For her impressive body of work, she's been shortlisted for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. She's been a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist and a National Book Award finalist. Dana Spiotta has also been a Guggenheim Fellow, a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellow, and she won the 2008-2009 Rome Prize from the American Academy in Rome. In 2017, the American Academy of Arts and Letters awarded her the John Updike Prize in Literature, and today she teaches on the faculty at Syracuse University's Creative Writing program. In conversation with Dana today is Chanelle Benz, author of The Man Who Shot My Eye Out Is Dead, and most recently, the New York Times notable novel, The Gone Dead. We both published by Echo Books. Her stories have been published in Guernica, Granta.com, Electric Literature, Fence, and she is the recipient of an O. Henry Prize. As of this fall, Chanelle is also the newest addition to the Syracuse MFA writing faculty, or writing programs faculty, where she's going to be teaching alongside Dana, George Saunders, Mary Carr, and Jonathan D. So congratulations, Chanelle. And of course, they are both here to discuss Dana's spectacular new novel, Wayward, which is out this week from Knopf. I was so happy to see Claire Massoud wrote a terribly insightful review of the book in Harper's, and she writes, quote, Spiotta's novels are unfailingly dense with life, the textures, digressions, and details thereof, and Wayward is no exception. Spiotta offers grand themes and beautiful peripheral incidents. She writes with sly humor and utter seriousness. We are so pleased that you're all here today. Thank you again for taking time out of your busy afternoon or evening to be with us. And please welcome Dana Spiotta and Chanelle Benz.
Thank you, Spencer. That's terrific introduction. Really appreciate it. So I think I'll start with a reading and then we'll go into the conversation. And I'll just set this up briefly. The novel takes place in 2017, and most of it is narrated by this woman, Sam, and she's in her early 50s, and she kind of is in this huge crisis and has blown up her life. And in this section, she is working out with her personal trainer, Nico. It's just very short, about 4 minutes. Nico was 25 and in top shape. He was constantly on a cut, or else he was on a bulk. But he always looked the same to her, young, perfect, ridiculous. And he talked constantly about body science and cutting-edge workout theories. As she trained with him, their interactions so bodily intimate and yet almost entirely shallow, Sam developed a fascination for these bro science types, not the roidy bodybuilders, but the natural performance athletes like Nico. When she drove to her boring daily errands or just drove, she began listening to hardcore fitness podcasts in which one bro interviewed another. Walk me through your bulk protocol. Everyone was always walking you through something on these podcasts. She learned about slow regression, pyramid sets, flipping truck tires, body by science, Navy SEAL fit, kinesiology tape, Wim Hof and warrior breathing, sledgehammers, log PT, rope climbs, wall ball throws, the benefits of hyperoxygenating or hypooxygenating while exercising, kettlebells, reverse pyramid sets, slow twitch versus fast twitch muscle fibers. Was it possible that inhabiting a human body was this complicated? She asked Nico at one point, more or less joking, but humor was lost on him. It is if you want to reach your highest potential, if you want to make real gains. What did she want? Did she want gains? Who didn't want gains over subtractions? Quantifiable, trackable, tape measure gains. There were the podcasts and then the YouTube videos, and Nico in real life, the in the flesh embodiment of a fully cultivated male body. Never before had she cared about these things, but here she was. Her middle-aged fascination with these young hyperfit men was a mystery to her. It was not sexual, not at all, almost the opposite. She gawked at them and their robust narcissism. Wondrous beings who felt no shame in exhibiting their vain pursuit of perfection. In fact, they bragged about it. They weren't self-absorbed. They were optimizing, not just looking better, they insisted, but improving lifespan. Not just lifespan, but health span, which meant you looked and felt good. You became and remained a paragon human specimen. You attended the unquestioned goal of getting ever stronger, lowering body fat, building lean muscle mass. The daily hours in the gym, the measuring of dietary macros, tabulating blood sugar and ketones and heart rate. They considered themselves biohackers, pushing their bodies into whatever shapes they wanted, fitter, stronger, better look, and better performance. But she wondered, better performance of what? Strength for what? Enhanced lifespan to do what? The rigor and discipline she got, the community, sure, the endorphin release, definitely. Endorphins were a form of endogenous morphine. They did make you feel a kind of body bliss. But the precise treatment of your own lifespan, the obsessive yet superficial self-betterment, the fetishy focus on the body, the relentless and desperate pursuit of constant improvement. And although it might seem that strengthening meant no longer weakening and that pursuing gains stopped or even reversed the decline we all experience, this couldn't be true. Your body went in one direction, didn't it? It wound up and then slowly wound down. Her whacked periods were a clear sign of the direction her body was taking. Maybe for men, it felt like less of an overt direction. But beyond the futility of body gains, what amazed her was their persistent insistence on boosting the self when the world, and this country in particular, was in disgraceful shambles. The progressing, ever-widening gulf of disparity in every sphere. And were we not also on the verge of an environmental apocalypse? People seemed more fixated than ever on notions of self-tend, self-care, self. In the current context, wasn't naked pursuit of health obscene? The self-contemplation down to the microbiomic makeup of your alimentary system? Yet such contemplation was divorced from any reflection. This seemed now more than ever the most American of myopias, this unapologetic, boastful even attention to the surface self. It sort of made sense though. A retreat to the local, the hyper-local and controllable, your heart, your lungs, your flesh. Fecal transplants, stem cell injections, increased mitochondrial sensitivity. One set to failure, Nico said. Isn't that what we were all doing? One set to failure, she joked. but he just smiled and lifted his glorious, chiseled, unwavering chin at the barbell. Let's go, Sam.
Thanks, Dana. You know, a few things strike me when during that reading, and one was just thinking about what kind of research you did to get all the jargon, and whether that was a pure chore or whether there was real charm to that. And the other was just, it made me think about, well, I guess in a couple things. One, the humorlessness. That's something that actually Claire Massoud brings up in her review, which I thought was really sharp. That a lot of this kind of like puritanical thinking in a way, or obsession, is very humorless. You know, like these young fit people are not getting the jokes. And then the other thing is just that, in a way, and I'll talk about it in a little bit, the story opens like a mystery, and there's no mystery. There's sort of like the eradication of mystery in this body hacking.
Great. I mean, great questions. I guess, yeah, I did. I mean, I think one of the things about Sam is that she both, she partakes of the things that she also is interrogating and critical of at the same time. So she is in fact doing this bodybuilding. So on some level, she does get it, but she also sees the problem in it. And I think I can relate to that as well, in that I do spend a lot of time, whether it's this or whether I was doing the kind of developer guy, or the weird women in their groups, their little rebellious groups that they form in Syracuse, that you pursue you write about these things because they are interesting to you, and the language is interesting, and the ideas behind the language. And when I would listen to a lot of podcasts, and I would get these mantras, these sort of cliches for each subgroup. And it was interesting to sort of see them and then dislocate them and put them in fiction and see them as prose, you know. And so I do like lists because you can kind of put all the words together, dislocated from their context, and sort of, and almost anything can be kind of poetic and also kind of ridiculous when you do that. And I think that's kind of a fun thing to do in fiction, is just sort of take something familiar and dislocate it and look at it from a different point of view. And the humorlessness, yeah, I mean, I think one of the salvations of maybe aging is that you have to have a sense of humor, because well, at least many people, or at least Sam, you become aware of just the futility of some of it, right? And she's definitely, you know, she's going through this perimenopausal stuff. It's a big part of the book. And so she's constantly kind of coming up to the limits of her body. And it's a big question for her, because I think one of the things she's trying to resolve is, you know, what's going to be the relationship to the rest of her life, you know? And she's at this place where she can look in both directions. She can see what she's done with her life so far, and she's not happy with that, but she still has something left. So what is this extra life for? I think is kind of a good menopausal question too. It kind of ties this idea that women used to feel when they were more tied to having to have endless children, and all the things that came with that, before there were reproductive rights, that menopause could be a liberation of a kind, right? That you were sort of liberated from one thing, the concerns of fertility, and then what, you know? And so that's a big question for her. So that, and then what was the last part of the question?
Well, just to go back to the thing in the beginning, as you were talking, it made me think like she's kind of a method actor.
Yeah. Yes. Well, you know, Chanelle has an acting background, and a serious one. And we talk about this sometimes, this kind of method writing. I do that. I do kind of submerge myself in whatever I'm writing about, and I try to experience it to a certain extent. And while you do that, you get caught up in it, you know? I mean, right now I'm wearing this little ring that tells me when to go to bed. Because I have insomnia, and it's supposed to help you tell you in the morning whether you were a good sleeper or not and shame you into changing your behavior if you weren't. So I did, there are always things that kind of stay with you when you dip into these worlds, and you try to have some irony about it. But yeah, I think that method, that idea of inhabiting it from the inside so you can feel it on your body as an actor, I think works for a writer too.
Yeah, I mean, I think writers are able to keep themselves a little less, they're able to keep like a toe out or a hand out or something, so they don't completely, because they have a kind of larger goal rather than just to kind of be this emotional athlete and sort of play the role. So maybe keep their sanity a little better. But I was also thinking, you know, that it's interesting that the novel set in upstate New York and talks about the Oneida community and thinking about this place of, you know, spiritualism. So it has that tradition of when people started thinking about mortality, when women come to the end of their fertility and, you know, they've had their 9 or 12 children and half have survived, that they were turning to seances and a very different kind of, you know, a kind of like outward focus. And this is sort of the opposite. And I wonder why that is. I wonder why our age is much more interested in that way. It's a much more inward gaze or physical gaze.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because maybe if you're, you can't be as much in retreat from mortality if you've watched children die. Then, I mean, we can keep the bubble of, we can keep the hard terms from ourselves for a lot longer. You know, in modern culture, there's a lot of distractions. And I think, so I don't think they had as much spiritual work to do as you might have to do now. You know, and I think it was interesting too, because when I was doing all that Oneida stuff, that was real method actory stuff too. I went and stayed there. You can go stay there. And it's a very spooky, fascinating, beautiful place, you know, but you can feel a lot of people have been doing interesting things there for a long time. And Syracuse is a place that has a lot of history all around it that's interesting and kind of overlooked and forgotten a lot of the times. And so that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write about this place, because as I've been living here for 10 years, I just find so many interesting things about it, interesting buildings, interesting past, you know, the Erie Canal, I've written about that. And I took a boat with my friend down the Erie Canal, and which still exists, but, you know, it's one of these hiding in plain sights kind of things. And that always it's interesting to kind of read these secret history that is all around you, you know, and Syracuse has that feeling for me.
Yeah, and since Sam is coming into her midlife and she's dealing with these night wakings and insomnia and hot flashes and rage, it is kind of like, and dealing with potentially, you know, worrying about her parents' mortality and that sort of thing, worrying about that kind of loss. It sort of is, you know, in the 19th century, as you're saying, we don't have to deal with the bodies, but they used to dress and prepare the body. So they really were engaging the body in a very different way. And it's almost like she now is engaging the body. But I wanted to talk about actually the beginning of the book. And I think it's interesting to me that it has a kind of a mystery to it, but almost like a fairy tale opening. Like a Grimm Brothers fairy tale, not like a fairy tale. There's like, you know, it's 3 sentences, there's a kind of inviting cadence, and then there's an opening image of the house. So one way to understand what had happened to her, what she had made happen, what she had insisted upon, it began with the house. It was the particular house, but it was also where the house was and where she discovered she wanted to be. It was a rundown, abandoned arts and crafts cottage in a neglected, once vibrant neighborhood in the city of Syracuse. Was this always the beginning of the book?
No, actually. So originally I started with when she does this, the not funny stand-up thing as a way of confronting midlife contempt for older women. I started with that, this kind of like really abrasive version of Sam doing that. And then it went to the house. And so it was kind of one of those things where you're like, how does she go from here to there? And that just seemed, like a kind of a way in, but it also occurred to me that why not do it in the order in which it happens? And I kind of, so that's when I came to this opening, and that rhythm, that very short opening chapter, and then the next chapter is a little bigger, and the next chapter is a little bigger. I wanted it to kind of dilate from that moment, which it became important to me because there's so many cultural representations of middle-aged people and middle-aged women where it's about you fall in love with someone because you're feeling you're losing your sexual attractiveness. And I didn't want it to be about that. I didn't want it to be that cliche of like, oh, I'm sad that I'm losing my beauty, or I'm not a cultural, I'm not a sex object anymore. I wanted it not to be that. And I didn't want her to get left by her husband. I wanted it to be her thing. So I had her fall in love with a house, but it's a particular broken down house in a particular place. And that made it compelling. I think she feels that she's the only one who can see how beautiful it is because it's so run down. And so that speaks to her. It makes her feel, I think, special, that she notices this thing that everybody else is ignoring. And I think she's trying very hard to separate herself from the suburban life that she's had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the architecture of the book kind of feels like we're, at least when we're in her point of view, that we're going into different, like it's the door into her, and then we go into this room, and then we go into this room. It's sort of like building out herself, and then something gets ripped down, or there's another door, you know what I mean? And we realize like, this is the truth. She's sort of looking for her authentic self, or just maybe for authenticity, period. So the novel is divided into two close third POVs, point of views, mainly. Sam, she's in her midlife, she's having a reckoning with life, and she's, anxious and exploring. And I sort of thought of her as someone who is chafing because the world itself chafes, so she sort of has this friction or is pushing back against it. She sees herself as a contrarian. And then her daughter, Allie, who is overachieving and brilliant, but also has that teenagerly brutality, who's also making mistakes, but at the same time, she has the privilege to make those mistakes, which is interesting. And so one of the things I thought was really interesting and rare was that, Sam is sort of Gen X, and I guess Allie, honestly, I barely know, is, I guess, Gen Z. I don't know, whatever they are now. And the tension between them generationally, I thought was really interesting, because I'm on the cusp of Gen X and millennial. So I always found myself looking up to Gen X, but I wasn't quite with them. But then I've never really felt part of the millennial. And so I thought it was really interesting, the tension between these two voices and how different they are, but how you can see the sort of reflection of the mother in the daughter. So how did these voices evolve?
Well, originally I thought it would just be from Sam's point of view. And then her daughter, when Sam in the beginning of the book has left her, she falls in love with this house, and she realizes as she's driving home that she's going to leave her husband. And what she doesn't realize is that her daughter's not going to come with her. Her daughter's going to get really angry at her and not speak to her. Her daughter's in 11th grade, and as you say, a high achiever, directed, focused kid, or so it seems. And she's furious at her mother and wants to do anything to push her away. And so the mom, so Sam is, sends her one text every day, which doesn't get answered, but she does it. And Allie lets her do it. And they, so then I just thought, I kind of want to see the same scene that Sam has thought about when Allie was younger from Allie's point of view. So I thought I'd just try writing it. And when I tried writing it from Allie's point of view, this whole character opened up to me, this voice. That was a lot. It reminded me a lot of myself at 17, but also what I've observed in Gen Z girls that I know. And I think most fiction has that thing where you take sort of one part of something you've experienced or observed, and you kind of push it to an extreme. And both of these women are kind of reckless in, I think, interesting ways that have consequences, which is always dramatic and exciting. You sort of see that play out. And we find out that Allie, as I'm writing Allie, I find out that Allie's having an affair with a much older man who's also supposed to be her mentor, and keeping it a secret from everybody. And that really interested me, because she's so smart, and in the way that you are when you're 17, your brain is just great, but you don't know anything because you have no experience, but you don't even know that. You think you know, and it's just such a dangerous place to be. And she does have a lot of privilege, and I think she ends up a lot closer to her mother and her values in the end. But she needs to have some space to figure that out, and and to make her own mistakes, which she does. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the characters I really love is MH, who's the founder.
Yeah.
And I could really feel her magnetism and her sort of perverse trickster nature. And how did she come about? And there are moments where she seems to really kind of gauge Sam. And I wondered if that perspective is true, right? They have this conversation where they're sort of saying, you're like this and you're like this, basically. And she's very sort of evasive, but she does talk about Sam sort of saving herself and wanting to save the world and that kind of stuff. And so I wondered, how this character came about, and if you felt like, if we're to read it, that she really does kind of get Sam for all MH's, flaws.
This is the tricky and wonderful thing about fiction, I think, is that, characters are not ideas. They're not, it's not a polemic, right? So MH is this, this not trustworthy character in a lot of ways, right? You described her as she's sort of like a cult leader, and she is, which is kind of funny because I never thought of it, but she's also there's another cult leader later, right, in Oneida. And but she, in that when they have their big fight, she says really smart things about Sam. She calls her a gentrifier and calls out her hypocrisy, and they kind of each lacerate each other in the way that friends can do. And maybe they're not even friends, just the way that people can do it. And so I think it's interesting that to have that come from a kind of unreliable character that is sketchy, and yet part of her power is that she is very smart, and can see things and call them by their name. And I think that's originally what Sam is attracted to her, is that she is kind of abrasive and in your face, and she's got a kind of glamour that comes from being fearless, which Sam is trying to be herself. So she overlooks the things that are the red flags, which are flying all around MH, and just kind of falls in with her. Right. So I do like it when characters, it reminds me of that great Harry Lime monologue in The Third Man, where Orson Welles, this famous monologue, and he's a pretty terrible guy, Harry Lime, but he says this kind of thing about history that's kind of brilliant, right? And dark. It's great to have characters do that, have so-called, the bad guys say really smart things sometimes that kind of hits it on the nose. It makes it more complicated.
Yeah. So your other books have been set in Los Angeles, Oregon, some upstate New York, Southern California, Seattle. But this one is set in the city where you live, Syracuse. We now live.
Say it loud, say it proud.
As I said, precariously placed camp table. So
Chanelle is amazing because she just moved to Syracuse like 3 days ago, and she doesn't have her furniture yet, and she's a real trooper to be here, and she's so brilliant. And I forgot to say this, that she is an amazing and fearless writer and brilliant, and so it's a great honor to be in conversation with her, and she's also a friend. Yes, sorry. Free you off.
So why did you set this book in Syracuse? Because I don't think you've said it in Syracuse before. I could be wrong. I think there were other towns in upstate New York. You know,
Yeah.
how did you decide? Because I mean, I know Syracuse not as well as you, but I know it to some degree. And there were some things I was like, oh, that's a real thing. But then there were other things that I wasn't sure. So I wondered about that relationship between the real and imagined, and with research, because I feel like there's so much history here, so much architecture here. And then you've got, you know, Clara Loomis, the 19th century feminist, who's sort of problematic, whose house Sam works at, and that sort of like, you know, invention there. And so I wonder what the process of research was like, as far as like the kind of texture of Syracuse and the architecture, deciding what to put in. And this, I think, by placing it in Syracuse, does that automatically mean that the book is closer to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, and on the one hand, you know, I thought it was really interesting because the book takes place in the wake of the Trump election. I wanted to kind of write about a city, a kind of Rust Belt small city that is not New York or Los Angeles, or San Francisco or Seattle or any of the coastal sophisticated cities. Something a little bit more middle America, I think. I thought that would be a more interesting place. And of course, you know, for me, the only way to talk about the bigger cultural moment is to be very specific, hyper specific, and kind of have, you know, locate it on the intimate plane of character and body and place. So once I decided it was going to be this small city, well, here's one, you know, right around me. It was, you know, it just seemed more and more interesting to me. And then once I decided it was Syracuse, then I just really enjoyed doing all the research. And I do find Central New York really fascinating because, you know, I read this book, The Stammering Century by Gilbert Seldes, and he wrote it in the early 20th century about the 19th century reform movements. And so many of them happened in this area. You know, the women's movement started not far from Syracuse, and the abolition movement was very active here because of the Erie Canal. There were all the, you know, to the burned over district and to Albany and the Shakers. There were all these amazing sort of alternative experiments in living, including Oneida, which is one of the most successful perfectionist communities, long-lasting ones, and it's all right here. And so I kind of got interested because I've had this long-standing interest in that kind of forgotten America, that kind of weirdness that America has that we just kind of obliterate. And you know, Erie Boulevard in Syracuse it used to be the Erie Canal, and it's a paved over arterial road full of horrendous plastic homogeneous architecture that you know, the Home Depot that you see in every arterial in every city, and that takes away the specificity of place. So I think, you know, Sam, and as I got interested in it, Sam became this kind of obsessed sort of autodidact amateur architectural person. And I like autodidacts because they get things wrong in interesting ways. And I like fiction because you can make things up to go along with. So I wanted to write about a 19th century suffragette, but I didn't want to write about any of the one. I didn't want to write about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you know, who's also problematic. So I invented one, but I put her in a real place. Oneida, with a real John Humphrey Noyes, is in the book. He was a real person. So when I'm talking about real people, I try to stick to the facts as much as possible, but I do make up dialogue that he says, and I have him in a sex scene. So obviously I did what I wanted with him. And so far he hasn't objected, but you know, maybe I'll get a visitation.
I'll do one more question, then I think we're going to go to the Q&A. So one of the things driving the book, and there's so much like velocity in the book, like I tore through this book, is fear. You know, fear of aging, fear of death, fear of the body, and not necessarily Sam's. It's, you know, it's a lot of the characters. Fear of entitlement, fear of blood, but also fear of retribution, right? For something that may or may not have been done, a wrong that may or may not have been committed. And so one thing I was struck by was Sam waking up at the 3 o'clock hour, because I think that's the worst hour to wake up. Like that is the true witching hour. Like that, to me, that's when, like, you know, ghosts come out. And so I wondered why it's such a driving force of the novel.
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, I wrote a lot of the novel at 3 a.m. Because
back to sleep. I'm like, I can't, something bad will happen.
What's so horrible about that waking up at that time, especially if you're having a perimenopausal hot flash or something, is your heart is going, you have this like adrenaline response, and you know you're not going back to sleep, but it's too early to get up. So this kind of despair sets in and you can just go in a dark place. And so, you know, at some point she just decides once she's in this house, she's just going to get up and make some coffee and go for a run, or she's going to she's not going to be, she doesn't want to think of herself as afraid, even though she is. And of course, you know, she's in a neighborhood that at 3 o'clock in the morning, lots of things happen. And she, so that created an interesting consequence, I thought, in the book. And really made her think about what she was really doing, and her own ineffectualness about it. Like what that I think one of the things that was interesting is that it's important to try and be a good person, but you're also just a person, and your life is finite, and you got to get over yourself. You're not really that important either. And that's a liberating thing. I mean, it's a good thing to sort of see. I think you want to get to that place where you can see the terms and accept them. You know, maybe that's a kind of spiritual place that to circle back to where we started, which doesn't mean you're off the hook for trying to make the world better, the opposite, but you're just not maybe as so self-obsessed that you have to, you know, fight off everything at the gym all the time. Yeah. To circle back to the gym.
Always about the gym. Thank you both so far. I am really enjoying this. I'm happy to move on now to the audience Q&A portion of our evening. We have a few questions here for everyone listening. Go ahead, submit your questions to the Q&A window at the bottom of the screen, and I'm going to be reading them off and then kind of appearing and disappearing and appearing and disappearing again. So don't mind me. Our first question looks like for both of you, it's a question about teaching. Can you talk about the writers whose work you love to teach, and are there any authors whose work you teach that might surprise us?
You go first, Chanelle.
Sorry, I was like spacing out a little bit. So writers I love to teach. There's a story by Kazuo Ishiguro that I love to teach. I think one of his only short stories I think it's called The Village at Night, and you can get it for free on the New Yorker. And it doesn't follow the traditional like story structure, you know, climax and then, you know, following action. It's kind of a cyclical story. And I find that a lot of times my students want to, you know, talk about non-traditional story structure. And that's a really good story to talk about it with, because you're asking like, why am I reading this? Since there's not that classic climax, you know, like what questions are we asking ourselves? And it's kind of the thing that's changing and sort of pulling you through that story is the truth. You're trying to understand if the protagonist, who's one of like Ishiguro's slippery, you know, unreliable narrators, you know, and he's very evasive. You're trying to understand who he really is. And as he encounters people and tries to kind of, you know, kind of weasel his way around what really happened and what the truth was. And so it's this sort of evolving relationship with the truth on one level that's why you're reading the story. But one of the interesting things is I always find that it divides the class. Like half of them love it and half of them, it drives them crazy. And it's never quite who I thought. So that's one of the stories I love to teach. What about you?
It's funny. I really like teaching that that John Cheever story, The Last Time I Saw My Father, because I teach it to both undergraduates and graduate students because it's a tiny story. Maybe it's 3 pages, 2.5 pages. And it starts with that idea, the title, right? And so the whole time you're reading it, you're aware that it's the last time I saw my father, but you don't know whether it's because his father is dead or because he doesn't speak to his father anymore. and there's this poignancy, and the story itself gets so kind of, it has a kind of almost artificial exaggeration to it that's almost funny, as the father is just fighting with these waiters and getting drunker at each restaurant until the son finally, and the son almost disappears until he gets kicked out of the last restaurant, and that's the last time he saw his father. And it has so much mystery to it, because you just don't know all the possible meanings, and you find yourself I find it so moving. So I think I like to teach stories that I can't quite figure out how they work, and they have that great mystery to them. I think Joy Williams stories are that way too. Stories I haven't quite figured out yet. And I think, well, how is this working? Why does this work? And the students usually come up with really interesting takes on it.
Excellent. We have another question from Joe, who asks of Dana, when you were interviewed in the New York Times, you said that, quote, "One of my favorite things is laughing at a joke in a really old book." And Joe wants to know, do you have an example that you could give us?
Well, I do this class every 3 years where I teach Ulysses, and there are a lot of like really silly jokes in that book, and some of them are funny still, and some of them are not. But there is this kind of moment when, this kind of canonical giant white male book that you've heard about your whole life that's supposed to be so difficult to read. And then there's just like a silly pun or something that's just ridiculous and hysterically funny. And then some jokes that don't land too. And it just makes you think about the writer, what he must have felt like when he made that joke, and I feel the same way about reading Moby Dick or something like that, where there's these kind of funny, silly jokes that are still pretty funny. And it makes you sort of think about the writer as a person, as a being on the other side. They're still kind of alive in the book because they've made you laugh. And most jokes are not, it's really hard to make a joke that stands the test of time. And a lot of times it's either character-based jokes or wordplay jokes that stand the test of time. Topical humor doesn't usually stand the test of time, sadly for me.
Yeah, Ulysses also has some of the best outhouse humor that I've ever come across.
True, there's a lot of
it's beautiful
scatological humor.
Let's see. Dean asks, there are so many dispiriting events after January 2017. How did this question, I believe, is for both of you. How did it impact you personally and/or your writing?
Yeah, that's why I wrote this book, because it was so dispiriting. And I just didn't think, I remember telling Chanelle, I don't know how you could write a book about what it's like to be alive in the United States without talking about what happened in the election and after the election and the country's, state. Because it's definitely shapes who we are and how we see ourselves. So I just don't know how you would not write about it, really. But yeah, so that's my answer.
Yeah, at the time I was writing The Gone Dead, so I was doing a lot of research about the civil rights era in Mississippi in the 60s. And I kept having to go back in history to try to figure out, what was going on in the 60s in Mississippi before we get to Freedom Summer. And I kept going back in history. And one of the things that I found really sort of galvanizing was I guess not galvanizing is not the right word, but that was one of the after effects of the feelings, was just the hell that the teenagers, the young college students, the preachers, the people who lived in the towns of Mississippi were going through to try to make the vote happen there, and the kind of terror and the kind of fear and all of the events that had happened prior to that, all of the racial terrorism that had been happening and continued to happen, and in a way continues to happen. And I think, what was happening in 2017 didn't feel so singular, didn't feel so new. And I think one of the things that came out of the Trump era is that there was a kind of knowledge shift for many people, that they realized what underprivileged people in this country or marginalized people in this country have already been going through, and how impossible life has already felt for them, or how powerless they've felt. And so I actually find that really inspiring.
Looks like we have a question from Brandy St. John for both of you. He says, can you talk about your writing process? How much plot do you know beforehand, and how much develops in writing and revision? And how do you approach revision?
You want to go first, Chanelle?
I muted myself. No, you go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have a very clear sense of, the story really comes out. I don't even have a clear sense of character until I've made them speak in some way, either their internal monologue or in dialogue. When I hear their voice and I have that voice, then that leads me to, like with Allie, it leads me to, oh, she's having an affair, which leads you to narrative, to plot. So often that is where I get, or in the case of Sam buying the house, has these consequences, and following the consequences creates the plot. And then as you're working, you start to sort of sense, and this takes time of going forward and following it out and kind of going where the energy is and where the consequence leads you. And then you sort of see, well, what are these things having to do with each other? And you start to think about the structural parts of the novel, and make some decisions. And those decisions about structure kind of inform the narrowing of possibilities that lead you to the end. So it's really kind of listening to the book as you're writing it, reading it over, taking notes, and thinking about it when you're not writing, when you're away from it, thinking about all the parts of it and what its meaning is, that and where you want to take it. So I think writing blindly is important in the beginning, and then starting to just pay attention to what you have.
Yeah, like the expectations you've created, the questions that you've asked in the beginning. I mean, I think the process for me is different than the novel from short story. I find the novel much harder, but I think in the beginning it is just writing, and then midway I sort of have to ask myself, like, what's happening in this scene, and what questions are being asked or answered in different scenes. But I usually do have an idea of the climax, or I think I do. And it's usually something overblown and operatic and ridiculous and melodramatic that I have to scale back. And by the time I get there, it's usually not what's going to happen. But I'm always like, yeah, I'm going to write this big, explosive, climactic moment. And that's what I'm moving toward. And as I get there, things I thought I knew fall away. And that's, part of the joy.
Okay, we have time for just one last question here before we'll wrap up for the evening. Let's see. So sort of related, I think, to the teaching question before, could you both talk about what it was like teaching this past year, and what were the pains or surprise benefits of teaching creative writing and trying to build a community on Zoom?
It was really hard. It's really hard. It turns out that that you need to have all these kind of casual moments in person. Writers, I think at first it seemed okay because we could all be on our own, but I think we like to be by ourselves. But it turns out that you do kind of need to be in the same room with people to read them and to love them, I think. And it was hard to do that via this. This is great for something like this, but for that intimacy, it was really hard not to have just incidental moments, Yeah.
I think a lot of my personal charm and my jokes were lost. It's because you can make a joke and maybe one person laughs, but a lot of people are on mute, or no one's going to say something back. It's just that you've lost that kind of repartee. And I think also because so much of communication is nonverbal, that you are losing a lot of those things. And so it can feel like, that you're kind of, that the conversation is sort of going from square to square to square, or it's me lecturing, and that I don't really, for the most part, want to be doing. But the one really positive experience I did have is I led a workshop at Tin House, and a lot of people were able to come. An Indian man who was living in England, he was living in London at the time, was able to do it because it was virtual and he could afford it that way. This Trinidadian woman was able to do it. So we had this really diverse group of different people writing very different things, who many of them normally wouldn't have been able to come, but because they didn't have to pay for the expense of flight and lodging and all that kind of stuff, they could be there. And so they really wanted to be there. And I think a lot of that energy kind of carried through. So the cool thing is you are able to attend these readings or go to these things that normally you wouldn't be able to access or do. But I think in terms of like day after day meeting for a workshop, it does feel a little grueling and you are losing out on some of the pleasures that make you want to come back.
Wonderful. And I also want to give a shout out to the Tin House Summer Workshop. They're, I mean, online again this year, I believe. Actually, I'm 100% certain they are. I think that actually takes place starting this next week. I was just trying to Google furiously.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. And all their programming is virtual. Shout out to Lance and India over there who run the show. And yeah, they have a bunch of free events coming up. Go check that out at Tin House Books website. Go register for some of those events because some of them are free and open to the public, some of those readings. All right, let's see here. Yeah, we're at the end of the evening. I want to express my enormous gratitude again to Dana and Chanelle for this really delightful conversation. And thank you to all of you out there who are spending your night and or afternoon with us. Seriously, go buy Wayward and The Gone Dead, both over at thirdplacebooks.com. Or if you're local to the Seattle area, you can come see us at any one of our 3 locations. This event was also recorded, which means you can go watch it again and again or share with your friends. And we'll be sharing that link with you all once it's posted to YouTube. Other than that, on behalf of the store, have a wonderful weekend and please be well.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Spencer. Thank you, Chanelle.
Thank you.